Hello everyone and welcome to our second week in summer learning. This week we are celebrating American Tales and we're going to be learning a little bit about the long tradition of quilting with our craft this week. I hope you enjoy it and we'll see you next week. So today we're going to be learning how to sew two pieces of fabric together and from the supplies that you got in your take-home bag, but you can also use this tutorial to do any other projects. You should have two pieces of fabric that have already been sewn together and they'll already have a nice strong seam, and then you'll have a piece of fabric that hasn't been sewn to anything, and we're going to sew that to the other two pieces of fabric. And you'll have some thread, some black thread, and what you'll need from home is a needle, and you can use any size needle. Sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're smaller. For this project, you should be able to just use any standard size needle and some scissors to cut your thread at the end. So to get started, we're going to grab our thread and we're going to unravel it. We're going to be very gentle about it so none of the thread gets bunched up or knotted, because then we won't be able to use as much of it. And once you have it nice and straight, just make sure to pull it apart, and then we're going to grab our needle. And your needle will have two ends. One end is going to be the sharp end, the pointy end, and the other end is going to have a very small hole at the beginning of it. You're going to pick up one end of your thread and you're going to push it through that hole. It might take a couple of tries because it's a little hard to see. You might need to use a magnifying glass, but once you have it pushed through, you just pull the thread. Once you have the thread through your needle, you're going to pull the thread until your needle lands about halfway through the thread. And the thread should be parallel to each other, so you'll have two sides of the thread. Then you'll take your two ends, and we're going to tie our two ends into a knot. I tied just a very simple knot, and I did it about 3 times. You're going to want your knot to overlap each other so it makes one big knot, so it doesn't pull through the fabric when you try to pull your needle through, because then it won't make the stitch and then the thread will just keep pulling out. Once you're satisfied with the knot that you have, make sure that your thread is straight, make sure your needle's in there right. We are ready to put the pieces of fabric together. So you're going to take the piece of fabric that's already been sewn together, and as you can see, when I fold it, it's going to be face up on each other. So the face side of the fabric is going to be touching the other one, and that's where the seam is going to go. So we're going to put the other piece of fabric just like that, and once we fold it back, it'll look the same way. Once you have the fabric situated how you want it, then we're going to pick up our fabric, make sure it's right there on the end of whichever side you want. We grab our needle and thread, and we're going to poke through for the first time. And you're just going to take the pointy end and poke all the way through, and then pull it through right up until the knot. And once you have the knot in there, and make sure there's no stray strings around, we're going to push it through the other side to make that first stitch. Once you have it pushed through the other side, right there, you're going to pull it all the way through again. And once it's all the way pulled through, you're going to start pushing down the same way again. And that's going to be your first 2 stitches. And just make sure that your string is always straight so it doesn't bunch up and you're not making more knots or anything like that. If you don't want to continuously be pulling your needle in and out and have to pull the thread all the way through, I'm going to show you how to make a different stitch. And you're going to push through, but you're not going to push it all the way through, and then you're going to push your needle back up through the bottom, and you try to gauge about how big of a stitch you want to make. So you push back up through, and once you have it through, you'll see it's you'll have that little gap where your stitch is going to be. And then you're going to push back down, and you're going to do the same amount until you sort of run out of needle that way, and just keep going. And then once you have it there, you're going to make 3 stitches, as you can see, because you have 3 on your needle. And then you're going to pull your thread all the way through, and it should look something like this. And keep your string straight and pull it all the way through, and see, it made 3 stitches and you only had to pull through once, so it's a little bit easier. We're going to go ahead and finish out this line together. So I'm going to do the same thing where I push through and don't go all the way through, and push your needle back through and keep going, and then you'll get to the end rather quickly if you do it that way. And see, I only had to pull my thread through twice to get that many stitches, about 6 stitches. And now we're at the end of the fabric, and as you can see, when I pull it back, it's going to look like the other side, and it's all stitched together. And we're going to tie off this end, and I'll show you how to do that very quickly. You're going to push back through on the end, and you're going to pull it all the way through like you did with your first stitches. And once you have that pulled all the way through, we're going to go back to the last stitch that you made. You're going to go to the back side of that, and you're going to push your needle just through that thread right under it, and then that's going to tie off your end. And that just makes the tie off a little bit stronger than if you just tied a knot, and it looks a little bit less messy. You won't have as many threads that you're going to have to cut off. And I did mine about 3 times, and there it is. There's your first line of stitches. But I want to show you that even on this first line, you still have a little bit of gaps. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a back stitch. And a back stitch is essentially just filling in the gaps from your other stitches. So you're going over your stitches and filling in those little gaps. So we're going to push back through where your last stitch was. And right there, you see our gaps. And we're going to push back through right where your last stitch ends. And then we're going to go back to the other stitch right where it ends. And pull it all the way through. You can do the same trick as we did before, or you can just do, to make sure that you hit those little gaps and make sure they're filled in, you can just push through normal. And there's all my gaps. All of my gaps are closed, and I have one long line. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tie off my end by pushing my needle through and pulling it through, and doing that about 3 different times. And then once I have my tie back done with those stitches, I'm going to tie off the end, making another knot. And I just made 1 knot, and we try to pull it as close as we can to the fabric so you don't have a really long string. And then I'm going to cut off my end. And I have plenty of thread left over. And there it is. And you got 1 really strong seam and your 3 panels now. And that's the great start. Make sure to trim off any loose edges or strings so they don't get in the way of the rest of your progress that you make. And once you have all that done, it's going to look nice and clean, and you're going to have these wonderful three panels that is going to make a great beginning to your quilt that you can put together. And you can just keep doing squares. You can look up different quilt patterns, but this is a great beginning, and you did a great job. Thank you so much for joining me in my sewing tutorial this week. Make sure to check out more of our summer learning activities at ashelibrary.org. Links are in the description. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you next time.